What Soviet soldiers said when they found 50,000 dead after a German retreat. The silence arrived first. Lieutenant Ivan Gorbunov noticed it 3 kilometers outside the town. A stillness so absolute it pressed against his eardrums like water at depth. No birds, no wind through the remaining trees. Just the crunch of his battalion's boots on frozen mud and the mechanical growl of the T-34s rolling behind them, their treads chewing up earth that had already been chewed and spat out a dozen times before. It was January the 23rd, 1904. The German army had pulled back 48 hours earlier, abandoning their positions in the Vitebsk region of Byelorussia without a fight. That alone had made the battalion commander nervous. Germans didn't retreat cleanly. They mined roads, torched buildings, poisoned wells. They left traps, but this was something else. Gorbunov raised his fist. The column halted. He could see smoke rising from what used to be the town center, thin gray ribbons against a sky the color of old pewter. His radio man, a kid from Smolensk named Petrov, was breathing through his mouth, each exhale visible in the bitter cold. "Sir?" Petrov whispered. Gorbunov didn't answer. He was staring at the road ahead, at what looked from this distance like a pile of discarded clothing near the town's outer checkpoint, dark shapes against snow that had been trampled into slush. He started walking again. 50 meters closer, the shapes resolved into bodies. Not soldiers, civilians. An elderly man face down, arms outstretched, a woman curled on her side, a child's boot, still laced, attached to nothing. Petrov made a choking sound. "Keep moving," Gorbunov said, though his own voice sounded strange, flat and distant, as if coming from underwater. They entered the town square. That's when the lieutenant stopped counting. 6 weeks earlier, the German Army Group Center had been in full retreat across the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, a withdrawal so vast and chaotic it left entire regions in a kind of administrative vacuum. The Wehrmacht was bleeding men and equipment by the tens of thousands, pressed on all sides by the Soviet winter offensive. High command in Berlin had ordered a fighting withdrawal, a phrase that sounded dignified in briefing rooms but translated on the ground to panic, abandonment, and increasingly desperate orders from officers who knew the war was lost but couldn't say it aloud. In Vitebsk and the surrounding districts, the German occupation had lasted more than 2 years. It had been brutal from the beginning. The Wehrmacht and SS Einsatzgruppen had implemented racial policies with industrial efficiency. Mass shootings of Jews, reprisal killings for partisan activity, forced labor conscription, starvation rations for undesirables. Entire villages had been razed. The local population, already devastated by Stalin's collectivization a decade earlier, found themselves caught between 2 totalitarian systems, neither of which cared if they lived or died. But the final weeks of occupation were different. As the Red Army pressed closer, German commanders received contradant orders. Some urged speed, abandon the territories, save the men, regroup on defensible lines. Others, channeled directly from Hitler's headquarters, demanded scorched earth, destroy everything of value, deny the enemy shelter, make them pay for every meter of soil. Major Heinrich Kessler, a logistics officer attached to the 202nd Infantry Division, wrote in his diary on January the 8th, "We are told to burn what we cannot take. The villagers watch us like ghosts. They know what's coming. They can see it in our faces. We are not soldiers anymore. We are grave diggers, burying ourselves." In Vitebsk, the local SD, Sicherheitsdienst commander, Obersturmbannführer Klaus Reinhardt, had other priorities. He had lists, meticulously maintained lists, of Jews who had escaped earlier roundups, of suspected partisan sympathizers, of anyone who had collaborated with Soviet authority before 1941. The retreat gave him one final opportunity. He would, he told his subordinates, complete the work before we leave. On January the 18th, orders went out to liquidate the remaining ghettos and internment camps in the region. Labor columns were to be shot on sight. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were to be emptied and burned. The work was to be completed within 72 hours. Local Wehrmacht officers protested, not on moral grounds, but on tactical ones. The units needed for such actions were already stretched thin. Moving slowly increased vulnerability to Soviet artillery, but Reinhardt had authority from Himmler's office. The executions would proceed. In the town of Krugloye, 20 kilometers southwest of Vitebsk, 200 people were herded into a barn on January 19th. The doors were locked. Gasoline was poured around the perimeter. Most died from smoke inhalation before the flames consumed the structure. The few who broke through windows were machine-gunned by waiting SS troops. In the village of Borki, 800 civilians were marched into the forest in groups of 50. Freshly dug pits waited. The shootings lasted 6 hours. Some soldiers later claimed they had been drunk, a defense that was true but also irrelevant. In Vitebsk itself, the remaining ghetto population, estimated at 3,000, was loaded into trains on January the 20th. The trains traveled only only 15 kilometers before stopping at a rail siding near the village of Ostrovno. The people were unloaded and forced to dig. By nightfall, the pits were full. When the German columns finally pulled out on January the 21st, they left behind silence and smoke and 50,000 dead. Lieutenant Gorbunov stood in the center of what used to be Vitebsk's main square and tried to think like an officer. He tried to think about reconnaissance, about securing the flanks, about reporting enemy positions and civilian casualties. He tried to think about anything except the smell. The bodies were everywhere, not scattered randomly. That would have been easier, somehow more comprehensible as the chaos of war. These bodies were organized, arranged. Some were stacked along the walls of burnt-out buildings, methodically positioned. Others filled basement windows, their limbs protruding at angles that suggested they had been shoved there and forgotten. In the town square, a mass of corpses formed a kind of irregular mound, frozen solid, dusted with snow. Most were civilians, women, children, old men. Some still wore winter coats, others were in nightclothes. Behind him, Petrov was vomiting into the snow. A sergeant named Dmitry Volkov, a veteran who had fought since Stalingrad and carried shrapnel in his hip, walked slowly along the eastern edge of the square. He stopped at a cluster of bodies near the remains of a synagogue. He crouched, stood, walked 3 more steps, crouched again. "Lieutenant!" he called out. His voice was strange, hollow, mechanical. Gorbunov walked over. Volkov was pointing at a girl, maybe 7 years old, frozen in a kneeling position, hands clasped as if in prayer. Her eyes were still open. "They shot them all," Volkov said. Not a question, a statement. "One by one, made them kneel, then shot them." Gorbunov didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat had closed. "Sir," Petrov said from behind them, we need to report this." "Yes." Gorbunov's voice cracked. "Yes, get me Major Sokolov on the radio." But even as he said it, he realized the inadequacy of the word report. What language existed for this? What words could he use that wouldn't sound insane or insufficient? By 1400 hours, Major Sokolov had arrived with a reconnaissance company and a political commissar named Leonid Brezhnev, not the future general secretary, but a lower-ranking officer tasked with maintaining morale and documenting enemy atrocities for propaganda purposes. Brezhnev carried a camera. He took 3 photographs before his hands started shaking too badly to continue. "How many?" Sokolov asked. Gorbunov shook his head. We haven't finished counting, but it's thousands. In this town alone, thousands. And there are reports coming in from other villages, from Borki, from Ostrovno, from... Show me." They walked through the town. Gorbunov led them to the basement of a schoolhouse where 200 children had been locked inside and left to suffocate or freeze. They inspected the remains of the barn in Krugloye, still smoldering. They stood at the edge of a ravine outside Ostrovno and looked down at the layers of bodies. So many bodies that Soviet combat engineers would later estimate it would take 6 weeks to properly excavate and bury them. At one point, Sokolov stopped walking. He was staring at a wall where someone, a German soldier presumably, had painted a message in white paint. "Hier war Ordnung gemacht." Here, order was made. "Ordnung," Sokolov repeated softly. "Order." Commissar Brezhnev was writing furiously in a notebook, but his handwriting had deteriorated into jagged, illegible scrawls. "We need to document everything," Brezhnev said. His voice had a desperate edge. "Everything. Names, numbers, evidence. We need the world to see this." "The world?" Volkov muttered. He was sitting on a chunk of rubble, staring at nothing. "The world doesn't give a fuck." "Sergeant!" Sokolov snapped, but Volkov didn't stand, didn't salute. He just kept staring. By nightfall, medical corpsmen had arrived to begin the grim work of cataloguing the dead. They moved slowly, methodically, their faces hidden behind scarves. A young doctor from Kiev named Anna Mikhailovna refused to wear a scarf. She walked from body to body with a clipboard, writing down ages, visible causes of death, identifying marks. Someone asked her why she wasn't covering her face. "Because," she said quietly, "someone should look at them. Someone should see their faces." By the end of the first day, the initial count stood at 11,000 in Vitebsk and its immediate surroundings. By the end of the first week, as Soviet forces moved deeper into the evacuated territories, the number climbed 18,000, then 30,000, then 45,000. The final estimate, compiled by NKVD investigators and military intelligence officers over the following month, settled on approximately 50,000 dead. Most were civilians, most were Jews, Belarusians, Poles, and others deemed enemies of the Reich. Most had been killed in the final 72 hours before the German withdrawal. The news traveled unevenly through the Soviet command structure. At the frontline level, soldiers processed the discovery in fragments, some through rage, some through numbness, some through a kind of stunned incomprehension. Letters home were often brief, vague, censored by commanders who feared the explicit details would break morale or be used against the USSR by German propagandists claiming exaggeration. Corporal Yuri Smirnov, writing to his wife in Leningrad on January 27th, "We have seen things I cannot write about. The fascists left nothing alive, not the old, not the children. When we find them, there will be no mercy. You understand? No mercy." That sentiment, no mercy, spread like contagion through the ranks. Soviet soldiers who had fought with a kind of weary professionalism up to that point began refusing to take German prisoners. Entire Wehrmacht units that tried to surrender in the following weeks were shot on sight or beaten to death. Officers who tried to enforce the rules of war found themselves ignored or threatened by their own men. Lieutenant Gorbunov, who prided himself on discipline, watched helplessly as his battalion cornered a retreating German supply column on February 3rd. The Germans threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Gorbunov shouted for his men to hold fire. They didn't. 70 Germans died in less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Gorbunov found Sergeant Volkov reloading, his rifle with steady mechanical movements. "Volkov," Gorbunov said quietly, "those men surrendered." Volkov looked at him. His eyes were empty. "No," he said. "They just ran out of time." At higher command levels, the response was more calculated but no less intense. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, received the initial reports on January the 25th. He read them twice. Then he summoned his senior staff and ordered the immediate formation of investigative commissions, teams of doctors, forensic specialists, NKVD officers, and journalists tasked with documenting the atrocities in exhaustive detail. "We will show the world," Zhukov said, "what kind of enemy we are fighting." But there was something else beneath the official outrage, a kind of grim strategic satisfaction. For years, Stalin had struggled to maintain Allied support while simultaneously being viewed with suspicion by the West. The Soviet Union's own record of mass killings, deportations, and purges made it difficult to claim moral high ground. But this evidence of Nazi barbarity on such a staggering scale, this could be weaponized. Within days, Soviet war correspondents were touring the liberated areas with international journalists in tow. Photographs were taken, films were shot. Ilya Ehrenberg, the regime's most prominent propagandist, wrote searing articles that were translated and distributed throughout the Allied press. "They left us a graveyard," Ehrenberg wrote. "Not a battlefield, a graveyard. This is what German order means. This is what European civilization looks like when it comes east." The Allied response was muted. British and American officials, while publicly condemning the atrocities, privately worried about the propaganda implications. Was Stalin exaggerating? Were these numbers reliable? The Soviets had a known history of manipulating casualty figures for political purposes. But then the forensic reports arrived. Independent verification by Red Cross observers, eyewitness testimonies from survivors who had escaped the roundups, physical evidence, execution sites, mass graves, German documentation found in abandoned headquarters. The numbers held: 50,000 dead, in one region, in one retreat, in 72 hours. It was, in many ways, a prelude, a preview of what the Red Army would find as they pushed west: Majdanek, Auschwitz, the death camps that turned murder into industrial process. But for the Soviet soldiers advancing through Byelorussia in January 1940, the Vitebsk massacres were their introduction to a specific kind of horror. Not the chaos of battle, but the methodical extermination of unarmed people by an army that had decided they were less than human. It changed something fundamental in how the war was fought. After Vitebsk, the Eastern Front became something more than a military conflict. It became a reckoning. What the Vitebsk massacres revealed was not new information. Soviet intelligence had documented German atrocities since 1941, but rather a clarifying crystallization of what the war meant in psychological and moral terms. For Soviet troops, many of whom had grown cynical after years of brutal combat and their own regime's indifference to mass suffering, the discovery reignited a sense of righteous purpose. They were not just defending the motherland or following orders from Moscow. They were stopping something monstrous. This was, paradoxically, exactly what Stalin needed. The Soviet war effort had always been framed in existential terms: defend the nation or be annihilated. But by 1904, with victory increasingly inevitable, the question became what kind of peace would follow. The Allied powers were already negotiating post-war arrangements. Poland's borders were in dispute. Churchill and Roosevelt were wary of Soviet expansion. The atrocities at Vitebsk gave Stalin a moral argument he could wield in post-war negotiations. Look what we stopped. Look what you would have allowed to continue if we had not bled for this. But the psychological impact went deeper than propaganda. For individual soldiers like Lieutenant Gorbunov, the discovery fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their enemy. Gorbunov had grown up believing in the basic decency of people, in the idea that even in war, certain lines weren't crossed. Vitebsk obliterated that belief. It forced him to confront a truth that many soldiers throughout history have had to face, that ordinary men, given the right orders and the right circumstances, will commit unimaginable evil. Years later, in the 1970s, Gorbunov would tell an interviewer, "I stopped seeing Germans as soldiers after Vitebsk. I saw them as something else, something broken. Even the ones who didn't pull the triggers, they marched past those towns, they smelled the smoke, they knew, and they kept marching." That kind of absolute moral certainty, while dangerous in its own right, became a unifying force among Soviet troops in the final year of the war. It sustained them through the brutal fighting in Poland, through the siege of Berlin, through the nightmarish casualties that piled up even as German resistance crumbled. It also paradoxically made the eventual Allied victory more complicated, because while the Western Allies could afford to treat the defeated Germans with a degree of legalistic fairness, tribunals, due process, rebuilding, the Soviets could not forget what they had seen. For them, every German officer, every Wehrmacht veteran, every civilian who had lived in the occupied territories carried a stain that could not be washed away. The massacres at Vitebsk became, in Soviet memory, a justifying event. It justified the brutality of the advance into Germany. It justified the mass rapes and civilian casualties that Soviet forces inflicted in retaliation. It justified the harsh treatment of German prisoners, the deportations, the stripping of industrial equipment from occupied zones. Did 50,000 deaths justify the suffering inflicted in return? That question haunted some of the men who had been there. Sergeant Volkov, who survived the war and returned to his village in Ukraine, reportedly never spoke about Vitebsk again. He worked as a carpenter, married, had 3 children, and died in 1968 without ever telling his family what he had seen. Dr. Anna Mikhailovna, who catalogued the dead, emigrated to Israel in the 1970s. In an oral history recorded late in her life, she said, "People ask if I hated the Germans after Vitebsk. I didn't. I hated what we become when we forget that other people are human. The Germans forgot, and then in revenge we forgot too. That's the real tragedy, not just the deaths, the forgetting." 3 weeks after the discovery, Lieutenant Gorbunov found himself sitting alone in a requisitioned farmhouse 30 kilometers west of Vitebsk. The battalion had moved on, chasing the retreating Wehrmacht deeper into Poland. The winter offensive was gaining momentum. Berlin was still a year away, but the direction of the war was no longer in doubt. He had a candle burning on a wooden table. Outside, snow was falling again, thick, heavy flakes that muffled all sound. He had a letter, half written in front of him, to his mother. He'd been trying to finish it for 3 days. "We have seen terrible things," he'd written, "things I cannot describe. When this is over, if I come home, I don't know who I will be. I don't know if the person you remember still exists." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he folded the letter, unfinished, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He would not send it. Some truths were too heavy to share, even with the people you loved, especially with them. Outside, the wind picked up. The candle flickered but stayed lit. Somewhere in the darkness, the war continued. Men were dying, orders were being given, decisions were being made that would shape the next 50 years. But in that moment, in that farmhouse, Gorbunov allowed himself the small, painful luxury of simply sitting still, of remembering the faces he had seen in the square, of acknowledging that something inside him had changed forever. He reached for the candle and cupped his hand around the flame, feeling its warmth against his palm. Then he blew it out. The darkness, when it came, was absolute.